Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our August 18th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. Today we're bringing you a recent conversation with Iowa's State Climatologist, Dr. Justin Glisan, about Iowa's wet summer and what farmers can expect for precipitation in late summer and fall. And later in the episode, we'll welcome on Dr. Scott Gerlt, the chief economist for the American Soybean Association, to talk about the wheels in motion to help boost domestic demand for soybeans. Let's start with state climatologist Dr. Justin Glisan. Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond caught up with Justin just last week.
Justin, hey, welcome. Thanks for being with us today. Let's talk a little bit about the weather and some forecasts and the year that we've had. First, go back to the last 3 or 4 years. Iowa's experienced extended drought conditions. How would you describe the severity and why that occurred the past few years?
Yeah, so you think back to spring, getting into early summer of 2020, drought conditions start to expand after the 2 wettest years on record. If you put them together, 2018, 2019, second and 12th wettest years, we get into a drier period of time, which expanded to 4 years. In fact, December 2023, the preceding 48 weeks, the 5th driest 4 years on record. So pervasive, widespread precipitation deficits that accumulate year after year. Now, of course, we've had some wetter periods during that drought. Again, the longest drought since the 1950s. We had timely rainfalls. We had record yields in 2021 and 2022. But overall, you look at the teeth of that drought was basically in 4 or 5 waves, with the final wave in 2023, where we saw widespread D2, D3, and a little bit of D4, which is the most intense on the D0 to D4 scale from the U.S. Drought Monitor. Luckily with the hybrids and timely rainfalls, we didn't see widespread crop failure as we had seen in 2012 and in 1988. So while it was a very long drought, we did have ebb and flow. We had improvement, we had degradation, but it kind of flip-flopped around the state. One year it was in west central and western Iowa, then it flipped to eastern Iowa the next year. So it wasn't widespread over the entire state. It was pockets here and there. And that's why it was a different type of drought than 2012 or 1988.
Well, this year brought a sharp change with above average rainfall in much of the state, actually record rainfall in some locations. What weather patterns or atmospheric drivers were responsible for this shift?
Yeah, great question. So you think about the Gulf states. Over the 4 years of the drought, a lot of the Gulf states, the southern states were also dry soil profiles. So any moisture flow off of the Gulf, which is our main moisture source, particularly in the growing season, a lot of that moisture was extracted out of the air masses and it didn't make it to the upper Midwest, hence drought perpetuating over 2020 through 2024. This year and last year, a very active severe weather season. 2024 was the most active severe weather season for Iowa on record. That pattern has shifted further south, a very active severe weather season for the southern states. Soil moisture profiles are not at capacity, but there's plenty of moisture there. So a lot of that Gulf moisture is able to make it into the upper Midwest. We've been in a flow configuration where we've just seen ample moisture from the Gulf, but also a secondary source is the monsoonal moisture from the Pacific. So 2 moisture sources coming together in late June into July, second wettest July on record behind the Great Flood year, July of 1993, about 1.5 inches off of that record. But we've had ample moisture to work off of. While we haven't had widespread severe weather, thankfully, this growing season, we had a derecho across northern Iowa. Overall, we've had a lot of thunderstorms, but a lack of severe thunderstorms. We're very wet in parts of the state. You think of Spencer, wettest July on record with a period of record going back to 1893. Also the seventh wettest month ever for Spencer. So depending on where you are, you look at north central, central, into eastern Iowa, top 5 wettest Junes and July. So we have ample moisture to work off of, and the flow off of the Gulf has been unimpeded. We had a heat dome built in third week of July. We call that the Ring of Fire configuration. Ridge riders around the jet stream, very warm temperatures, but Bob, the dew points have been so high in the 70s. Overnight lows have been anomalously high. We see that with disease pressure in corn and beans, depending on where you are. We're not cooling off at night, but we also have enough moisture in the atmosphere that we're not evaporating a lot of that soil moisture. So we're really just perpetuating the wetness. Luckily, coming into the growing season, we were drier on the soil moisture side and lower on the stream flow side. So we had plenty of capacity to uptake the amount of moisture that we've seen this summer, and we don't see widespread flooding, thankfully. There are pockets in Iowa, in eastern Iowa, where we've seen flooding. But what's also been remarkable in July are the amount of inch plus rainfall events. I've had 5 in my rain gauge in Des Moines, and you're getting rainfalls in south central Iowa, eastern Iowa, 4 to 5 inches. It's been just ample moisture to work off of, a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, and you're getting these really high intensity events where you're really stacking up precipitation amounts.
Along that note, I talked with one of our crop reporters in Western Iowa yesterday. Actually, she dropped me a text and said, wow, we got 5 inches of rain yesterday. So, I mean, there was a pocket over there, and that's what we're seeing, those 4 and 5 inch rains.
Yeah, and no steering flow to push them off. So they basically sit over the same part of the state, or they train over the same location. And that's where you just see these higher intensity events. You're getting rainfall every 2 or 3 days in July. You look at the last 10 to 15 years of July rainfall trends, we're actually been seeing a dip anywhere from 5 to 10%. We're way over that dip this July.
Historically, how unusual is it to swing from prolonged drought for 3 or 4 years to such wet conditions in a single growing season?
Excellent vantage point when you're talking about these extremes that we're seeing, wet or dry. You think about the 1990s, a very wet decade, capped off by 1993, the great flood year, as I mentioned. Late 2000s, also very wet, 2007 to 2010, some of the wettest years on record at that time. And then you had 3 years of the 2011 to 2013 drought. I mentioned 2018, 2019, the 2 wettest calendar years together, followed by the 5th driest 4-year stretch on record. So again, it depends on your averaging time frame. But what we're seeing trend-wise, in fact, over the last several decades, a warming atmosphere, more water vapor availability, we're seeing the spatial extremes lock in more persistently. So wetter wets, drier dries. I also think back to 2018, the wettest year for the northern third of the state, D3 drought conditions in southeastern Iowa. You'd only have to go 4 or 5 counties north or south to be in one historic extreme or another. So this is just what the trends are showing us. We're seeing long-scale droughts followed by longer-term wetness, but we're also seeing longer-term wetness and dryness co-located within the Corn Belt or within the upper Midwest, depending on what year you're talking about. We're seeing the extremes lock in. Part of this has to do with a relaxed temperature gradient between the mid-latitudes where we live and the high latitudes, with the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, more warming in the Arctic basin. It's called Arctic amplification. This relaxes the temperature gradient between where we live and the high latitudes, slower jet stream. We get more persistent behavior, and that's all tied in to these wetter wets and drier dries. I'd need another hour and a half or 2 hours to really get into the weeds with the behavior that we're seeing, but we are seeing an uptick in the extreme events.
You talked a little bit about soil moisture. Maybe we can just touch on that a little bit. We've got to have ample.
We do. And if you look at southern Iowa, southwestern Iowa, basically straddling the Iowa-Missouri border, the Nebraska-Iowa border, that's where we see the driest soils. They've been wetter than they've been over the last 4 or 5 years. So you look from basically central, north central over to eastern Iowa. soil moisture profiles, if you look at a percentile basis, so take 100 years of information, the wettest that they've been in 20 to 30 years. So a lot of this July rainfall with increased vegetative demand, pollination and tasseling, some of that water was used up. But now that we're on the downhill slope of physical maturity in corn and beans, they're not using a lot of water or as much as they did during tasseling and pollination. So we're banking soil moisture, which is great for drought conditions, great for building up a surplus for the next growing season, but we do need to dry out. We need an extended period of time where we can get some of that moisture extracted out of the profiles. So again, all D1 drought has been removed from the state as of last week, and that's a reflection of elevated stream flows, but also that soil moisture and the amount that we've recharged. We're still working off deficits from the previous drought, the 2020 through 2024 drought. You think of aquifers and longer-term hydrological issues. But if you look at the short-term soil profiles and precipitation deficits, we're doing pretty well.
Let's turn to crops a little bit. Farmers often talk about wanting to be not too dry, not too wet, not too hot, not too cold. So what challenges does this year's excessive rainfall present for crop development and disease pressure as we head into harvest?
We've been trending away from that Goldilocks zone with these extremes becoming more extreme. Luckily, the seed hybrids are drought and wetness tolerant. Now, of course, you need to plant the right variety. We never know if we're going to get wet or dry. There were stories floating around on social media about 2025 being a dust bowl or a massive drought across the upper Midwest. Well, my colleague up in Ames, Dr. Dennis Toddy, termed it the mud bowl for how wet we've been, particularly in July. We think about 4 years of drought followed by the second wettest July on record, depending on where you are in the state. The crop looks pretty good, but with those overnight temperatures being so warm and the amount of moisture in the air, disease pressure has been increasing. And talking with our field agronomists, southern rust is a concern. Other diseases, not particularly widespread, but of course, with the configuration we've been in with the amount of warmth and wetness that we've seen recently, that's where you can start to get into problems. I think it's going to be a great crop. We definitely need to dry out to get the combines out there. Now we've got some time for that, and those outlooks are trending in the right direction. But again, that Goldilocks is going to be a problem moving forward. Now, I mentioned the statistic. We've lost anywhere from 5 to 10% of regular rainfalls in July during the warmest month climatologically. We've actually expanded the growing season by anywhere from 15 to 20 days over the last few decades. So we're building in a buffer zone for if we do get too wet in fall, too wet in spring, if we get planted too late, if we can't harvest on time, if we get very wet in summer, very dry in summer, widespread drought. All of those very complicated parts of the climate system, again, make the Goldilocks zone almost impossible to reach. And that's where science has come in. And that's where field practices, cover crops, no-till practices, locking that moisture into the soil profiles, some of those mitigative measures can help artificially produce a Goldilocks zone. But these are the things that Iowa farmers, being amongst the most resilient farmers on earth, they always figure out a way to get a crop in and get a crop out. And I think that's what we have going for us.
If we turn to forecasts a little bit for the fall harvest season, what's the current outlook in terms of temperature, precipitation, and the potential for a wet or dry window the next month or two?
If you're looking at the short-term outlooks getting us into third week of August, we are still seeing a stronger warm signal, so above average temperatures. And again, a lot of that has been those overnight lows with how high the dew points have been. Those dew points give us an idea of what the basement is for those temperatures. So if you have a dew point in, like, let's say 68 degrees, your overnight low is probably not going to get below 70 degrees. It's just the way the atmosphere works. We do see a lean, wet signal, at least in the short term, 6 to 10. Now, that's not a gully washer signal, but it does suggest an active pattern holds on. What we really need is some wind. That wind would really help dry things out at the field level. Looking at the second part of August, I think it will really hinge on how active the tropics get, how active our hurricanes become in the Atlantic. Where the Bermuda High is, where it's situated, would give us more landfalling hurricanes in the Gulf versus on the Atlantic side. So all those little indicators that we look at are suggesting that second half of August and then the August, September, October outlooks leaning warm and dry. Now, not a strong lean warm and not a strong lean dry signal, but as we sit right now, those outlooks are showing the hallmarks of a warmer and drier configuration redeveloping after this very wet period that we've had.
What about if we push it out a little further and look into September, October, and November, December?
We're about 50-50 on the chances of La Nina reemerging. We're currently in what's called ENSO neutral conditions, so right between El Nino and La Nina. But as a reminder, when we talk about weather in the summertime, a very low correlation to the phase of El Nino or La Nina because it's thunderstorm-driven precipitation versus the low pressure systems that we get during spring and fall and then during wintertime, larger scale, synoptic scale systems that bring us widespread weather patterns. Now, as we transition to potentially La Nina, that has implications on wintertime behavior, but we're still at 50-50 on whether we stay ENSO neutral or we transition to La Nina. But one of the hallmarks of La Nina winters is slightly more snowfall. Now, the caveat there, we were in La Nina conditions last winter, weak La Nina, fourth least amount of snow across the state of Iowa. So it doesn't always correlate well. But if we look at the longer term seasonal outlooks, we are showing the signature for warmer temperatures through fall and into early winter. Now, it's still a season out, so I don't want to pull the crystal ball out too much, but it'll really hinge wintertime behavior on if we do shift to La Nina conditions.
I know we talk about the forecasts and going out months and months and months. How confident can we be about these fall and winter weather forecasts? There's got to be a typical margin of error, right?
There is. An excellent way to discuss that is you looked at the initial and the final July outlooks. Both were showing no clear guidance on the temperature side, but a dry signal. We were on the opposite side of that, unfortunately. As a climatologist and a meteorologist, I can take one hat and put the other one on when it suits me best. Those climatological outlooks for July missed the mark. I really think it hinges on the amount of soil moisture we had towards the end of June and an open Gulf. Those two things, those factors, at least to me as a climatologist, suggested that that dry signal didn't make a lot of sense to me. What I think happened is, given that we didn't have a clear signal from the Pacific, that these climate models can sometimes fall back on those trends that we've seen recently. And I mentioned that if you look at the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a dip in July rainfall that might have leaked in to the climate forecasts. Given the law of averages, given how wet we've been, I would hope that we would swing in the other direction and that dry signal does come through. We start to get a more robust idea of what our climate signals are showing us, particularly as we exit summer from local thunderstorm-driven rainfalls to the larger scale weather patterns that come across the United States every 5 to 7 days. So if those hold true, those August, September, October, and then September, October, November outlooks do show the warm signal and a slightly drier signal.
Well, we talked about the more variable weather patterns that we're having. Advice for farmers, planning, field work in the months ahead.
So again, we need to dry those soil profiles out. We don't want combines getting stuck out in the fields or compaction. We talk about compaction issues as well. Those 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks, if you go to the Climatology Bureau's website, just Google Iowa Climatology Bureau or go to the Climate Prediction Center's website. We have those 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks. Those give us an idea in the short term of whether we're moving in one direction or the other. But we also have those monthly and seasonal outlooks, particularly when we're starting to get planted. They'll give you an idea if we're going to be wet or if we're going to stay dry, what variety to plant. But also think of the amount of moisture that we have on the landscape, or on the flip side of that, how dry we've been from 2020 to 2024. Any practice that you can employ that keeps the water on the landscape, particularly during drought conditions. So again, no-till, cover crops. It also increases soil porosity, so infiltration better, but also soil health. Talk with your field agronomists. Have them come to your farms. They are a wealth of knowledge. They help me. They're my eyes and ears out there. I field scout with them often. Form those relationships because that's where you can get the best information. And then pester me with questions on the weather and climate and trends that we're seeing, because knowing where we're moving, particularly in precipitation patterns, but also in temperature, and what those trends are showing us over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years can kind of get you better situated for the extremes that we can expect and how to mitigate the more impactful results from those extremes, whether they're precipitation extremes or temperature extremes.
Well, let's end with this. I know it's way too early to be thinking about 2026, but early signs, what's it look like next year? What's your best guess for wetness, dryness, heat, cold? What are we going to see next year, do you think?
It should be an interesting growing season. I say that every year. Banking the soil moisture right now in the warmest part of the year, that's got to be a plus. If we get dry in fall, we could extract some of that soil moisture. You think back to September last year, a very warm and dry September, backsliding into drought because of those longer term deficits from the 2020 to 2024 drought. We had the 9th wettest start in 2024 through June, busted that 4-year drought. Then we get dry in fall. We start dry 2025, and then we have a very wet June and July. So we mentioned this earlier, the wet and dry extremes are occurring more often, closer together. So it's hard to tell what 2026 will bring, but the initial thought right now is banking soil moisture is an important thing to do, particularly in summertime.
We'd certainly welcome a short break from all this rain, especially on the heels of Iowa's second wettest July on record. We appreciate Dr. Glisan offering his outlook for the coming months, and if you'd like to keep tabs on his predictions as we inch closer to harvest, we've included a link to the Iowa Climatology Bureau website down in the notes for this podcast episode. Next up is Dr. Scott Gerlt, who serves as chief economist for the American Soybean Association. I'm sure the soybean growers listening in today are familiar with some of the trade challenges facing U.S. soybeans in recent years. But what about the domestic side of the equation? Spokesman reporter Corey Munson had a chance to discuss that with Dr. Scott Gerlt earlier this month.
Scott, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today. I want to talk a little bit about domestic and export use of soybeans. So first, walk through the state of things. I know we've talked a lot about shifts in that demand. What's going on with soybeans right now as far as who's using them, how much, and where they're going?
So soybeans really developed a lot of their growth as an export crop, and that export was largely concentrated on China. And so as we grew acreage, as we grew yields, we were really dependent on that market. Exported about half of our soybean crop every year. Around 30% of that would go to China. But what we've really seen in the past 5 years or so is export growth is pretty much flatlined. Instead, where the demand growth has come in has been the domestic market. And this is for a couple of reasons. We had the trade war 2018, 2019, and we saw China kind of permanently switch to more Brazilian crop. So Brazil increased area. We still send a fair amount of crop to China, but instead of 30 million metric tons a year, it's like 20 million metric tons. So that market has really not been as hot for us, but instead we've seen renewable diesel come on in a big way in the soy sector. So for your listeners that may not be familiar, we have biodiesel that's been around for a while that can be made with soybean oil, other vegetable oils and fats, and it's typically blended up to a certain level. Well, in the past few years, renewable diesel's come on the scene, and it's also made with pretty much the same feedstocks and is also a diesel product, but it meets the same standards as petroleum diesel. So it's a drop-in replacement. And so that market has gotten pretty hot, which has encouraged more domestic crush. So instead of really growing on the export side, we've been growing that domestic crush side for the renewable diesel market.
Yeah, and as I understand it, we have something like 20 new crushing plants either planned or currently under construction Is that correct?
Yeah, and some of those 20 have been built out. We've seen some pullbacks here or there, but yeah, whenever this whole boom took off, we saw kind of left and right all of these new crush plant announcements for expanding or new crush. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of renewable diesel announcements. So the crush was kind of following to provide the feedstocks. And if all of those crush plants would have been built or expanded, that would have been about a 30% increase in domestic crush. So we had about 60 crush plants in the United States before this boom, to kind of give you some scale. So this is a pretty big deal. It doesn't happen very often that we get this sort of quick expansion in the industry.
And so to be clear, when we're talking about feedstocks, we're talking about the oil from the soybean being put into those renewable diesel products. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's completely correct. So feedstocks is kind of the bulk component that goes into the process. So soybean oil is a major one, but it is certainly not the only one. Canola oil can be used. Used cooking oil, so what comes out of the fryers. Tallow is also used. So there's a range of products, but soy is one of the big ones.
So how are these investments in crush and in soy oil and renewable diesel really impacting how farmers grow soybeans? And from a profitability standpoint, what's the opportunities here?
So this affects farmers in a couple of ways whenever we see these new crush plants. One is increased demand. The rising tide lifts all boats, right? So more demand domestically means futures prices are going to go up. And that benefits everyone in general. The other way it helps is new crush plants help local bases as well. So we worked with our partners on the checkoff side of the United Soybean Board to commission a study that was done at Purdue and Illinois University. And they found that a crush plant increases local bases by, I'm going to round, but about 10 to 25 cents a bushel, depending on how close you are to that crush plant. And so that's a very real impact as well. I mean, and a lot of these new crush plants are in Iowa, not exclusively. So you see prices go up overall, but if you happen to be closer to a crush plant, you're also going to see your basis improve. And that really kind of brings things home on the soybean farmer side. And ASA has been very active in the space for that reason, because this is really something that puts money into farmers' pockets.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier that for a long time, soybeans had been kind of a export-driven product for us. And I know we talked, you mentioned briefly China and some issues like that. So can you just give us a quick overview of sort of what has changed in export markets in the last, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah, happy to. And soybeans are still an export crop and will continue to be. It's just we haven't seen the growth in demand coming from that side. What really changed is the rise of Brazil. Brazil's the largest soybean crop producer in the world. They're the largest soybean exporter in the world. We saw them come online over the past couple of decades. And some of this goes back to some soybean embargoes decades ago. And Japan, which was one of our main buyers, went down and made investments in Brazil. Brazil created varieties that would work. They have a research, kind of like our USDA research arm called Embrapa, that really put a lot of funding and a lot of technical work into developing varieties. And so Brazil has continued to expand. They have a lot of land, very low value land compared to our prices here in the United States. So that's a major advantage. They also have fairly low seed costs, and they have favorable exchange rates for the export market. We compete very well in some ways in the U.S. We tend to use less fertilizers, less pesticides. So we have some real advantages there, but really the cheap land, the access to land, and being able to convert more native land into cropland has really been their advantage. It's allowed this growth. So we saw this happening for quite a while. The real change, if you will, the paradigm shift, was that first trade war we had in 2018, 2019. At that point, China did not want to buy U.S. soy. Soy is typically the largest product China buys from the United States. It can change a little year by year, but that was a major pressure point in the politics of this. So China put tariffs on U.S. soy, and even when it made sense to pay the tariff, we didn't see China coming to the United States to actually buy. So because of the politics of the situation, they were trying to source as much as they can from other places, and that was largely Brazil. So Brazil, really stepped up to try to meet that need. They expanded their acreage because they have land that can be expanded. Once that conversion occurs in the cropland, it doesn't really revert very quickly. I mean, the investment's already been made. And so that was a shift because we've never seen China come back in a big way, or not in the same way since then. They came close in the first year, 2020. They were running lower on soybean stocks. Their hog herd was being rebuilt after African swine fever. So they made some big purchases, didn't quite get to the levels they were before the trade war. But since then, their levels have been declining of purchases from the U.S., while Brazil's sales continue to go up. So that's been the major paradigm shift. I mean, we are expanding into other markets, but China buys 60% of the traded soybeans in the world. So you can't easily shift. So that shifting takes time, and it's being done. But I think that's really kind of what has put us in the situation is Brazil has some competitive advantages. So does the U.S., but Brazil's advantages have allowed them to expand, and then just the geopolitics have really encouraged the largest buyer to put more investment down there, which China has been doing, investing in some of their infrastructure.
Is China still the biggest destination for U.S. beans?
Yes, by far. As a percentage, it's not as large as it was, but yeah, it still buys the majority of U.S. beans.
So getting back to domestic use then, and a little bit more about these crush plants and whatnot, I understand there's some proposed federal rules on imported feedstocks, and this is something that kind of came up this year and late last year quite a bit in discussions. But these new rules that they're trying to get into place or are in place, you'll have to fill me in, but they favor domestic feedstocks for that oil production. Can you briefly talk about that, kind of what those rules are and what's changed, what needs to change?
Yeah, I think the key word being briefly, because I think we could talk for several hours about this. So I'll try to give it the very condensed version. Historically, federal policy didn't incentivize one type of feedstock or another. So whether you use soybean oil or use cooking oil, and in the past few years, canola oil, you received the same federal crediting. That wasn't necessarily true on the state side. So we talked about the rise of renewable diesel. Most of the renewable diesel is actually going to the state of California for their low carbon fuel standard. And they give different credits based off of what feedstock you use. And so things that are considered waste feedstocks, like used cooking oil or tallow, actually get very high credits. We can go deeper into that, but for the sake of time, we'll just kind of leave it as they get very high credits. And so we saw imports of those products really skyrocket in the past couple of years. There's been a lot of concerns about the integrity of the used cooking oil. I should clarify on the import side. Domestically, there's really not much question. It's used cooking oil. But the EU used to import a lot from China. They started becoming very suspicious about its integrity. And we saw all those shipments, instead of going to EU at that point, start coming here. So the market was really flooded, and we have fairly fixed blending levels under the renewable fuel standard. And so what that meant was displacement of soybean oil from these imports. A lot of had questionable authenticity. And so we've seen the federal side really step up. And there's been two policies on that front. The first is the blending tax credit, which is now called the 45Z. If you hear much about biofuel discussion, you oftentimes hear that term thrown around quite a bit, 45Z. It was actually going to incentivize a lot of those waste feedstocks more than soybean oil. That's what it originally had. But this year, as part of the One Big Beautiful bill, that was fixed. So actually soy gets about the same credit level now, and only feedstocks from North America are eligible for the program. So instead of that tax credit going to a lot of the imports, they are no longer eligible. The other one is the renewable volume obligations under the renewable fuel standard. EPA has to set those levels, and what they've proposed is that imported biofuels would receive half the crediting as domestic, or fuels produced from imported feedstocks would receive half the crediting. So you receive the full credit if you produce the biofuel domestically with domestic biofuels. Otherwise, you get half the credit. So you're not out of the program. You just don't get as much credit. Now, that one is still a proposal, but we should know by the end of the year exactly what decision EPA makes on this. And I'll say this is a break with the past for EPA. Generally, everything receives the same credit, but we also didn't see these large imports like we have the past few years. And so EPA has recognized that that's really not the intent of the program, to start bringing in all these imports and kind of pushing out some of the domestic supply. So they're really looking at ways to try to fix that.
So when you look at the tug and pull of demand then, did the increased availability of that cooking oil reduce domestic demand, or did it just not allow it to grow further or quicker?
That's a really good question. And I think it depends a little bit on what time period we're looking at. We did see growth in soybean oil use for biofuels over the past couple of years. I think it would have been faster, and soybean oil would have been more valuable without those imports, right? So there was that effect already. But in 2025, I think it became one of actually dropping off soybean oil use. So in 2025, we saw a major pullback in biofuel production. for a couple of reasons. The change in the tax credit had some effect, but also EPA set the blending levels too low. And they've acknowledged that. I mean, they've publicly said that. But what we saw whenever biofuel levels dropped quite a bit was there was a major pullback in soybean oil used in biofuels. Like it dropped by about half. End of 2024 to beginning of 2025, soybean oil used in biofuels was dropping by about half each month. We saw a little bit of reduction in like used cooking oil imports, a little bit, but not a lot. It actually got to the point earlier this year, we were importing about as much used cooking oil as we were using soybean oil in biofuels. And UCO goes for biofuels. There's not really much other stuff that's being imported for. So at that point, I think we can safely say that soybean oil was directly pulled down. It wasn't just the growth was more limited. It was really being pulled back hard because of those policies.
Well, it sounds like that was a good change that we were able to get into that bill. So
yes, we're very happy about it. I mean, biofuels have been the growth sector, but we've had some major challenges with all of this. But lately, there's been some wins in getting that fixed. I mean, we're not across the finish line yet, but signs are looking really good.
So kind of big picture then, do you think these shifts in demand are going to cause long-term structural changes to the overall soy market? I mean, are we looking at a future where we have more and more domestic demand and potentially less exports? Look at your crystal ball for a second.
Yeah. First, I'll say the soybean's a big crop, and like a big ship, it doesn't turn quickly. And so I do think we will continue to see more domestic demand. I think exports are going to be a very big part of the picture still. Maybe we have less of the growth there in the short term for a while. I think there has to be some equalization eventually with Brazilian land prices in the U.S. They don't have to be equal. There's a lot of reasons those prices will never be equal, but Brazil's land costs need to kind of come up a little bit more, and they are getting there to really kind of slow down their growth and really allow U.S. to continue growing in that export market. The crush plant growth here is permanent or nearly permanent. I mean, they don't have to run if margins aren't there, but right now we're seeing the policy that really supports their utilization. So I think for the next few years, we're going to continue this trend. It's hard to say anything with certainty about where trade policy is going to end up. Right now, the huge uncertainty there isn't helping exports. We haven't seen China book any U.S. beans for this upcoming crop that starts being harvested next month. And the world as a whole is down as well. So all signs as of now are pointing to probably reduced exports. But some of this really depends on future policy decisions that are made, biofuel policies that are made, trade policy decisions that are made. And even if we do put more into biofuels, the soybean oil that's being used is 20% of the bean. The other 80% is the soybean meal. And we can grow domestic demand for meal some, but I'm not sure we can really grow it at those levels needed to fully absorb that. So we're still dependent on exports, even as we use more soybean oil for biofuels. That's kind of the long, multi-handed economist answer to a simple question. But I do think the current trajectory will continue for a bit here, at least.
And are you aware of additional markets that we're courting right now for our soy products?
I mean, we've seen several markets kind of step up here. Like Mexico has increased their purchases for the new crop, as has Indonesia. Frankly, U.S. soybeans are priced a little more competitively right now. Our exchange rates are down, which helps. We've been, as an industry, very actively engaged in places like Egypt, and they've really come along. We have partners, the United Soybean Export Council, and then a group called WISH within ASA that are constantly working on developing those markets. But a lot of those are much smaller markets than China. And so it takes a lot of those put together to kind of equal the China effect. And, there's places like India as well that have a lot of population. They'll probably never be a China. Their meat consumption patterns are very differently. And so they may never consume the same amount of soy meal, but they are population-wise a very large market. Although right now we have very high tariff levels on them. So I think there are opportunities there. I think as populations continue to grow, or at least in some parts of the world, as incomes grow, there will be more demand. But it's not going to be probably quick enough in any particular region to offset a China.
Finally, can you just do, once again, big picture, what are you optimistic about and what concerns do you still have about soybean markets?
Oh, man. I'm an economist, which I think makes me a little bit of a pessimist to begin with. And so sometimes I get reminded I need to have more things I'm optimistic about. I am optimistic about domestic biofuels right now. We had some challenges. The challenges haven't all gone away, but signs are looking really good at the moment. I think we're going to have a more resilient domestic industry on that front. We're going to have more demand that's there, better crush margins, better basis. I'm really excited about that. if I'm looking at the glass half full, we are rearranging global trade, and there's potential to pick up some markets there and get some better market access. Although generally, U.S. has enjoyed fairly favorable access, but again, looking at glass half full. On the challenges side, there are a lot right now. As mentioned, trade, there's a lot of downside risk there for us. Biofuel still has some downside risk. There's a lot more things we could talk about too that we haven't even touched on, such as pesticide policy, making sure we have access to pesticides. There's some consumer and political movements on what are deemed seed oils, which includes soybean oil. And as we see with the Make America Healthy Again movement, they're really pushing removing that from diets. I don't think we've really seen that play out on purchases, but that movement is there. But I think big picture, long run, I don't think the demand for protein is going to go down. And soy is still primarily a protein crop. I think demand for vegetable oils is going to continue to increase as well. It's just a matter of making sure that we stay competitive in the United States in those markets.
Thanks, Scott. We know the soybeans we grow here in Iowa have incredible potential, so it's good to hear about evolving soy markets here in the U.S. It's also fascinating to think about how soybeans can continue to be used in some unexpected ways that touch our lives every day, like the soy-based foam in our shoe soles or the soy-based adhesives used in wood products. In fact, Iowa Farm Bureau is actually in the process of releasing a series of videos on those unique uses for soybeans and other Iowa-raised farm products. That 40-part video series, which is titled 40 Reasons Why America Needs Farmers, celebrates the 40th anniversary of the ANF initiative that started with the University of Iowa football team during the 1980s farm crisis. We'll be releasing new videos in that 40-part series each week leading up to the annual ANF game day at Kinnick Stadium on October 18th. You can view the whole series by following Iowa Farm Bureau on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok, or by heading out to americaneedsfarmers.org. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next episode on September 1st. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.